Okay, everybody, welcome. And I would like to really welcome David Orenstein. And I will read he's a full professor of anthropology at Medgar Evers College of University of New York, which is where Michael went, I think. Yes, Michael, my husband, went there years ago. And
Michael.
studied
Nice.
meteorology.
Oh, nice.
So one thing that there are several things about David that are interesting, but one thing is he's up there and his students got impacted by the shooting yesterday in the subway.
Mm-hmm.
Did they come back to class today?
Yeah, I had about half of my class yesterday, and I didn't have classes today, but from what I understand speaking to some colleagues is that more students are back on campus. Because I think everybody's sort of in tragedy. Some people just, it's fight or flight. And I think most people are trying to cling to normal routine, and going to school is like normal routine. Given the fact that the last 2 years, all education has been online, it's only in the last semester or two that we've even started to even come back to campus. So kids really want to be back on campus. I'm sorry, students really want to be back on campus.
So so they'll be coming back now, but they haven't found whoever did it.
Oh, no, they did.
Oh, did they?
They did today.
Yeah, in the East Village.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
That's good.
they arrested him. He didn't put up a fight or anything.
Okay. Good. So also, David is did you say you were past or you're now the president of the Secular
correct.
Humanist Society?
Yeah, the Secular Humanist Society of New York, yeah.
Okay. So he's been around and he's going places even now. So I'm really glad. And I think that I became aware of David when I, maybe from the Humanist Journal, and I discovered your book. I found the book, Darwin's Apostles.
Mhm.
So we read it and I just loved it. In fact,
Oh, thank you.
I'm looking at my notes again thinking, oh, I want to read it again. I loved the book. And we invited you to come here to Harrisburg, which you were going to do 2 years ago before COVID, and then that kind of fell apart. So now we said, okay, we can do this on Zoom. So
Sure.
Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, and it's great to be with you and to be with everyone online in the weeks and years to come. I hope that for a variety of reasons that we'll have a chance to really be able to be together more physically. And so let's trust in science and remember to be good to each other and wear our masks whenever we need to, and we'll get there. We'll get there. I mean, the good news is that for us, we're here and we can live to tell the tale and we can move forward. I once heard someone say that there's a reason why the rear view mirror in your car is about this big and your windshield is this big. And that's because everything that's coming at you is much more important than what's in your rear view mirror. And I think it's a good analogy for what we've been through for the last 2 years. We certainly should remember those who passed away. We should certainly be cognizant of the issues and the global health crisis that this caused. But really now, I think it's a chance to look to the future and remake and recreate these connections that are so important. And I think they really do make us human. This has been a very unnatural thing because we're such a social primate species, to be stuck in our rooms or in our houses and not being able to really connect to people. And I think as and I don't know if anybody here is in the psychologist or in the mental health area, I think that we're going to see issues with mental health from this crisis for years to come, sadly, you know. So this is part of the healing, believe it or not, whether you like Darwin or not. This, just being in the presence of each other, is a form of healing, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I should probably change the screen here so it records a little differently. So anytime you want to start,
Oh, here, okay.
David?
I forget that's what I'm supposed to do. I just enjoy talking to you, you know.
Yeah, I do too.
Oh, right, I'm supposed to be presenting. Okay. So the theme of this really comes out of the purpose of the book that I and my co-author Abby Hafer wrote some time ago. It took about 20 years for Darwin to write The Origin of Species. It took us about 2 years to write this book. And the book came out on the anniversary of the original publication of Origin of Species in November of 2019. And subsequent to that, I was supposed to be on, and Abby as well, on both an individual and group speaking tour to promote the book starting in 2020. And of course, you know, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And I think I did about 1 or 2 programs I was supposed to fly to Poland to promote the book. I was supposed to go literally all over the world, and all of those plans went out the window. So the book is still, and Rachel, I thank you for your very kind comments. The book is still fun. The book is still, I think, relevant, even though we have a different administration than we did when the book came out. But I hope you'll enjoy the presentation, because for me, and I know for a lot of people, you know, Darwin is really helped in the 19th century to help actually usher in the 20th century. So many thinkers, philosophers actually saw in Darwin's work, and Wallace, we can't forget Alfred Russel Wallace, the importance of understanding the material cosmos and the importance of understanding selection and change over time, that it really fueled not just what would become the biological sciences or the, you know, chemistry and things like that, but Darwin's work had a huge impact on political philosophers like Marx and Engels, and on so many other intellectuals of the 19th and 20th century. And we'll go into detail here, but I think that's what's so fascinating to me about Darwin's work, is that it's not just about biology. It's about, quite literally, and of course I'm an anthropologist, so I see these things holistically, it's about the nature of nature. And that's what's so important. And while the main part of the talk today really focuses on Darwin and most of the people who we call his apostles, who were mostly men, we can't forget that there were so many people in Darwin's life, and by extension in science, that have had a huge impact on what we know about the universe, what we know about biology, what we know about life on Earth, as well as life around the cosmos. And so, you know, I often give this talk in February because that's when Darwin Day is, and Darwin Day is now spread to like the whole month of February. Except, you know, there are other things that are happening in February that are really important too, aside from International Darwin Day. It's Black History Month. It's the National Day of Women and Girls in Science. And so, especially in the enterprise that I like to see myself in, which is not only education, but also as someone who regards himself as a scientist, that, you know, it is really important that we move from a time where we take our blinders off as a culture and try to recall and remember, while at the same time empower people who have been left out of the conversation of science and out of doing science, and who have done science but have never been part of the story of science in the way we know Darwin, the way we know so many other male scientists, right? If I asked everyone here to name 5 male scientists, you probably all could. If I asked you to name 5 Black scientists, or you know, someone of a different pigmentation, right, Black or brown, right, Native people, whatever, it would be really difficult. It would be really difficult for some people to name 5 women scientists. And so, you know, we should really be remembering, in this case, because the talk is about Darwin, that's great, but we can't forget all the people in all walks of life, in all countries, of all genders, of all sexual orientations, of all ages, who have impacted our life through the good and hard work of either discovering or uncovering facts about nature which have made our life better. And so I just like to do an advertisement for that, because I appreciate and respect Darwin's work, but it's hard to talk about Darwin without at least tipping my hat, so to speak, to all the other people who have been part of this construct of science to make our world safer, richer, and kinder. So when we talk about Darwin, often, you know, he is either lauded or rejected in many cases, depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the popular culture. However, there is acknowledgement that the understanding of evolution, that is natural selection, is up there in terms of great concepts which have changed our understanding of our human place in nature, with things like RNA and DNA, the concept of zero, understanding E equals MC squared, and evolution is right up there with all of those things. In fact, now this is not a scientific poll, but Time magazine not that long ago did a story on the 100 most important people of history. And Charles Darwin, in this particular poll, and again, it wasn't necessarily scientific and it wasn't necessarily academic, Darwin came in at number 12. And, you know, since this is an American poll, it's not surprising that Jesus winds up on top in this particular poll and everything. But you guys remember Casey Kasem and America's Top 40?
Yes.
Maybe, yes?
Yes.
Maybe, okay. Well, you know, I always like to put on my Casey Kasem voice and say, you know, coming in at number 12 is Charles Darwin, his theory of natural selection. But what I also like to do is dig deeper into the data. And if you ordered this same list, right? And for those of you who like science and statistics, you know that you can play with numbers and everything. But if you just eliminated the religious, the fascist, the slaveholders, and the conquerors from this 100 top list, Darwin moves from 12 to number 4. So that's pretty good. If you take out all these negative people who may have had an impact on the world, but maybe didn't necessarily impact it in the most positive way. if you asked that same question and added the key phrase, did you impact the world in the most positive way, you would see Darwin would come in the top 5. So I love history as an anthropologist, and I always like to think about not only Darwin's historical place in the world, but also our humanity. And if you look at Darwin's work, how it affected so many other people and different thinkers, with John Dewey back in 1910, and don't forget, The Origin of Species came out was published, and its original publication was November of 1859. But here we are 50 years later, and John Dewey, who is an influential educator, talks about Darwin as having an intellectual temper that helped introduce a way of thinking and a way of being able to transform our ideas of nature and logic. And I think that's really important. So you can see, even, some people write books, myself included, and, they might wind up in the mainstream public for a short time and are forgotten. But with Darwin's case, he is still relied upon even in 2022 for his important work. And here we are 50 years after the publication of Origin of Species, and you see that his work is still lauded. Same thing if you look at W.E.B. Du Bois. And I won't go in and read everyone because you can see it on the screen, but you see that, Du Bois sees Darwin as offering yet another form of liberation. That is, W. Du Bois is writing about, double consciousness and Black identity and what it means to be Black in America. And he's also a fan of Darwin, writing about the importance of not only human achievement, but the freedom that comes with the knowledge of knowing that we are all one human family. So that's quite liberating as well. And again, as I said earlier, we can talk about Darwin strictly in terms of biology, but we can really also talk about Darwin in terms of his impact on social justice, on education, on business, on a million different areas of philosophy. Now, as I said earlier, I really do like history. And so while Darwin and Wallace are the catalyst for really synthesizing natural selection and putting it into a mode of understanding that could be tested through the use of the scientific method, the idea that natural selection was even a new idea is actually a bit of a fallacy. You have Greek philosophers in the 7th century BCE talking about life evolving from the sea. Of course, Plato and Aristotle are talking about what would eventually become the great chain of being, that there is a progression of sorts from simple to more complex beings. Chinese researchers in the 4th century BCE are writing about species changing over time. Well, if that isn't natural selection, what is? And in the 12th century, certainly before the real rise of Islam, where as Europe was in its dark ages, Islamic and Arab science was really thriving. You have Nasir bin Tusi speaking 700 years ago about the same things that Darwin would come to recognize and realize at the same time as Wallace in the mid-1800s. And of course, as we begin to move closer to our own time in the last 300 years, there are people that Darwin and Wallace and many historians and scientists would have been influenced by as well. Cuvier, of course, discussing adaptation. Lamarckian coining the idea and the concept of biology. Linnaeus, who is coming up with the great classification, known as the Great Classifier. Erasmus Darwin, who is Charles Darwin's grandfather. Now, all of these men, throughout their lives, some might have been deists, but they were all men of faith. And even if they flirted with the idea that there were mutable forms and things changed over time, it was still God did it. It still required a divine catalyst to make everything work and operate. And that for many of these people, they saw God's work in the science they were doing. And what's ironic is, of course, and the thing that many people quote T.H. Huxley on Darwin's work is that, T.H. Huxley said that essentially Darwin killed God because you don't need a prime mover to have natural selection. There's no evidence for one. We can see adaptation, we can see genetic drift, we can see gene flow, we can see all those things, and none of the science requires the divine to make things so. Of course, one of the most influential scientists, von Humboldt, who was an explorer about 50 years before Darwin went on his 5-year journey on the Beagle. And Darwin, of course, read all of Humboldt's work and was fascinated. In fact, if you've ever gone to South America, you might have heard of the Humboldt Current, C-U-R-R-E-N-T. That is because of Alexander von Humboldt. So this person was a scientist. He went to the same areas of that Darwin went to in many places and had a huge impact on Darwin's life. He probably was, if he was a believer, he might have been a deist, like many of our founding fathers, but he was definitely not a religious person. And so you have here is this separation of science and religion starting at about 1780 or so, and then leading into the 19th century, into the 20th and into the 21st century. But a very important person in Darwin's life. So really what is so profound about natural selection is that in its simplicity. That is basically what Darwin has postulated in Origin of Species, which, by the way, there's no word in Origin of Species about human evolution. There is adaptation, there is a fitness for how things change over time, but humans are not mentioned in the Origin of Species. We don't get Darwin making the connection of natural selection and human evolution until he writes The Descent of Man. So this is the important thing that I think we should always remember, that not only is this incredibly important and valuable insight, but it's like Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the closest to the truth. And what Darwin came up with in his 20-year study after coming back on the Beagle is exactly that. And he did this without the virtue of scanning electron microscopes. You know, there was no understanding of genes when Darwin was figuring this stuff out ex post. So he was looking at slight modifications in things like mollusks and birds, you know, like Darwin's finches, but he wasn't doing it understanding the underlying mechanism of it in terms of genes and DNA. There was no science of genetics when Darwin was doing his research. So essentially, Darwin postulates, as does Wallace, that populations change over time, and those traits are supportive, that support survival and reproduction will continue in species depending on the ecology in which they're found. That sort of wraps up reading Origin of Species, which is about yay thick, into about that much. And of course, you know, if you wanted to talk about, well, you know, how does this impact as a predictive model, right? Does natural selection work as a predictive model? It certainly does, because we can back it up with not only genes, but fossil evidence, even regarding our own human history. And so I like to throw this in. You know, both gene flow and fossil evidence shows very strongly that we have an African ancestry, that at 300,000 years ago, archaic Homo sapiens sapiens were living in Africa, somewhere in some places East Africa, and in some places West Africa, in Morocco, and that based on our hunting and gathering earliest modes of how we adapted to the environment, we spread out. But we were not the first hominid species to do this, because Homo erectus, for which we owe our own lineage to, right, and anatomically, and Neanderthals as well, did it first, which is why you don't find Neanderthals in Africa, because they evolved separately in Europe and in Asia. But you find Homo erectus outside of Africa, as you find it in Europe and you find it in Asia, and of course, then you find anatomically modern human beings. And once we start to spread out, we spread across the globe, as our technology allows, as we follow the herd, and so on and so forth. So again, the evidences for natural selection in our own organic sense, as well as our social sense, is in the historical record. It's both outside of us and inside of us in our genes. So if you ever get a chance to do like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you can see where your haploid group is, you know, and see what you're made of, if you will, which ironically is something, and I know this is a bit of a tangent, that most people who are white supremacists refuse to do, because they're so connected to race theory and quote unquote whiteness, that the minute you say, wait a second, you are 12% Asian, or God forbid, 7% African, you know, people go off the deep end. But that's the truth of science. We all share quite a lot of our own genes, the same genes. And it's also important to really talk about Darwinism and social Darwinism, because they are often, for those who either don't understand natural selection or who want to deliberately confuse and damage Darwin's reputation, they will conflate the idea that Darwin said that all of human society works the way biology does, when in fact Darwin never said that. And the term social Darwinism, which was born in the 1870s, it infuriated Darwin, because he never saw the idea of good, better, best in human culture at all. In fact, Darwin was anti-slavery, and he wrote how much he really couldn't stand and was reviled by slavery during his writings on the Beagle. And so just some other background that I always like to share. Although Darwin did have his failings because he was a 19th century guy, right? So Darwin was anti-slavery, but he definitely really believed strongly that in English, the superiority of English culture, in fact, he was an anti-suffragist. He didn't think that women were equal. He felt that they were the fairer sex. And we'll talk about that a little later. He felt that there was incredible value, not from a sense of Christianizing the world, but teaching the world English values to make the world safer. So here's this guy who comes up with this earth-shattering and life-changing idea called natural selection, who himself was not the most liberal person. Many of Darwin's apostles, however, were part of the suffrage movement, part of the equal rights movement, anti-slavery, so they were abolitionists. Darwin never spoke in those terms, but he was anti-slavery. So in 1859, when Darwin finally gets around to publishing Origin of Species, because he receives this 20-page letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who is in the Amazon and doing his research on butterflies and coming up with quite literally the same ideas, but encapsulating what Darwin had been working on for 20 years and had come up with a book like this to 20 pages, it pushes Darwin to finally publish. First, Darwin gets really depressed because it's like, wait a second, this is my life of work, and here's this guy coming up with this stuff and saying it much easier than I could and more succinctly. And the reason why Wallace even contacts Darwin is because even during Darwin's lifetime, before he published The Origin of Species, although he was a very private person, he has a very long and deep correspondence with scientists and intellectuals around the globe. In fact, you can go online to what's called the Darwin Correspondence Project, and you can find letters to and from some of the most famous scientists of the day who are writing to Darwin. And Darwin was about 10 or 12 years older than Wallace. So Darwin was much more established. He'd already published his book about his multi-volume book about the voyage of the Beagle. And so he was very well known in British intellectual circles and scientific circles. And so people would send Darwin stuff from their own travels because it was still the age of exploration for the most part. And so they would take specimens of flora and fauna and send it to Darwin so Darwin could analyze it. It was a very fascinating time, almost a giddy time, where Darwin was the center of that world for many people. So during this time in England, as we find, I think, even in our own time today, that England under Queen Victoria was steeped in the occult. Seances were really the thing to do. Reading tea leaves, holding events where you were dealing with the metaphysical, because Queen Victoria was so enamored by metaphysics that it trickled down to the rest of English society. So that was sort of strike one of the social current that why Darwin took 20 years to publish. Another is the fact that, just like as I showed you in the 17th century, even in the 18th century, many people still felt that science and religion were part of the same magisteria. And for many of the most powerful intellectuals of the time, they saw the conflict, and not only denied that there was a conflict, but said there couldn't be a conflict because God made everything happen. And Darwin was not an atheist until much later in life. So Darwin was, in fact, a believer. In fact, he started medical school. He went to school to become a doctor, and like many people, changed their majors. Darwin actually entered school as studying to be a physician, and left with a degree in theology. Because if you weren't going to be a doctor in Victorian England, then the only two really vital things that you could be, if you were a person of letters, or if you were not in the aristocracy. Darwin was not part of the aristocracy, but he was part of the elite. His father was a doctor. He married Emma Wedgwood, and if you have Wedgwood china, that is from that family. So you really had in Victorian England 3 possible jobs to really do, and that was doctor, clergy, or barrister. And so I guess Darwin didn't want to be a lawyer. I'm married to one, and I'm glad I'm not a lawyer. I'm a humble anthropologist. Because she does the real work. I get to have fun, and play with skulls all day and everything. Where was I going with this? I'm so sorry. So science is connected, and science and religion are still connected in the minds of many people, and who are willing to destroy your career like they did to Joseph Hooker. And Joseph Hooker was the son of, I think, Joseph Hooker Sr., who was the head of the Royal Kew Gardens. Because Hooker was a friend of Darwin, they tried to destroy Hooker's career, because Hooker, who was Darwin's best friend, best bud, supported natural selection. The Church of England, as we find in some parts of America now, right, the evangelical churches or other churches, have had huge sway with the aristocracy and the power. And so the Church of England, when Darwin published Origin of Species, basically almost excommunicated Darwin. They hated him for publishing this, because basically what Darwin said was, well, all people are the same, so you don't need a God, and you certainly don't need England to run the world, right? If we're all the same and we come from a common ancestor, then why is it, right, that your culture or your military or your business have a right to take something that doesn't belong to you? And so there was an economic consequence to fighting Darwin and Darwinism in Darwin's time. So Darwin himself was incredibly shy, and he was neurotic. If you don't, Darwin suffered from illnesses that we would, I think, today consider psychosomatic. And he did have neuroses, and he did know that his work would have incredible influence if it was established. And so when it came to after 1859 and it came to debate Darwin's work, it wasn't Darwin doing the debating. It was Joseph Hooker. It was T.H. Huxley. It was Alfred Russel Wallace. So he was a prolific writer, but he really spurned the spotlight. So he would not be a good, today, you almost need to be a popularizer of science to get science into the consciousness of most people. And you can think about some really important popularizers of science like Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson. And these are people who knew how to speak in public and use the media to express and grow interest in the public's interest in science. Darwin was not like that. Darwin couldn't do it. And as I mentioned before, these were the folks who were, I would say, and there were a lot more than these 5 people, certainly, but these were the people who really were Darwin's advocates, chief advocates. And we purposely used the word apostles for the book because we wanted to de-religionize the idea of what an apostle is. When we think about apostles, we always think of the Christ story, but the earliest version of the word, which is Latin, which just means the follower of somebody, right? So Alfred Russel Wallace, John W. Draper, who, by the way, is buried here in Brooklyn, New York, who's a British scientist, helped found NYU Medical Center. Asa Gray, who was an American biologist and a religious man, but believed that you could see God's work in Darwin's work, and said, you know what, you can accept all of the stuff that Darwin says is true and just go to the fallback position of God started it all, and now he's no longer involved. And that was sort of Asa Gray, who was a brilliant biologist in his own mind, in his own work. T.H. Huxley, of course, who again was known as Darwin's bulldog, who was so supportive of Darwin and always edging him on to fight. He was, I always think of T.H. Huxley as sort of being the Christopher Hitchens of his day. Like, he delighted in embarrassing the church and embarrassing clergy for their ideas. And he was a very in-your-face guy, a true activist and a social activist, not just for science, but for so many of the things that we take for granted now in terms of human rights and civil rights. And as I mentioned before, Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was Darwin's long-time friend and colleague. In fact, it was Hooker, although sort of everyone read pieces of Origin of Species, but Hooker really edited the book. Hooker and Darwin's wife were the chief editors of Origin of Species before it was published.
It's really dark in here.
So,
right?
There are 2 June 30th that are really, really important in the story of natural selection and the origin of species. The first actually is in 1858. Oh,
Al, can you mute your can you mute?
I'm getting up.
Can you mute your computer? Sorry.
we're just getting a little background noise.
I'm standing up to turn on the lights. Right, Cooper.
Maybe I can do that.
All right, well, I can power through. That's okay.
Okay, maybe I
Okay, so there's a tale of 2 June 30ths here. Both before and after the Origin of Species is published in in 1859 is June 30th, 1858, where at the Linnaean Society, the combined paper citing both Wallace and Darwin is published in the Linnaean Society, saying, guess what, everybody? Natural selection is here. Eureka, we figured this out, and we're putting it forward. And that was with Darwin's acknowledgement. However, it wasn't with Wallace's acknowledgement. Wallace was surprised to know that his 20-page paper would become a portion of Darwin's work for the Linnaean Society reading of the understanding of what would become as natural selection. The next June 30th, that's really important, is the 1860 debate, which is usually known as the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, because it goes with Soapy Sam Wilberforce, who was the Bishop of London, I believe, who took the point that, you know, Darwin is crazy, God created everything, you know, it's an infamia if you're Italian, you know, you're blaspheming the Lord by saying that you don't need God to operate nature. And of course, Huxley, of course, batted all of those things back. But the important thing to understand that while it's called the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, it wasn't just Huxley who was in this, probably the most famous debate of natural selection of the 19th century. It also included Joseph Dalton Hooker and John W. Draper. In fact, Draper spoke first, and he published this great book about the conflict between religion and science. And he postulated, as Madeline Murray O'Hair would 100 years later, that the Dark Ages that were so fueled by religious fervor and religious violence put our understanding of the world back 500 years. Joseph Hooker, who again was Darwin's bestie, spoke about the science and understanding and the nature of natural selection within terms of botany and what would become biology. And T.H. Huxley, of course, who just ripped Wilberforce to shreds in that debate. And while there is no transcript, by the way, I wish there was, but there is no actual transcript of the Huxley-Wilberforce debate. However, news reports of the time, which was the Twitter of the time, right? Which was the social media of the time, right? Not just pamphlets, but news reports talked about how Huxley essentially wiped the floor with Wilberforce losing terribly in this debate. We would not see another really strong debate between the importance of science and reality versus religious fervor until, I think, in America in 1925 with the Scopes monkey trial, to be perfectly honest. And then, of course, you have this brilliant biologist, Theodorus Dobransky, who really sums up the value of Darwin's work for biology, but really for pretty much all of the physical sciences. And he said, basically, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That is, if you took evolution out of it, all the things that evolution means in terms of understanding that species adapt, that they change over time, that they can go extinct, and so on and so forth, that all biology would fall. Like, it's almost like playing Jenga. You pull out the knowledge, and then the whole theory collapses. And then you don't have anything, because you can't replace it with anything. So I always like to say this is from Darwin's, this is a very famous sketch from Darwin's notebook in the 1830s, where he sort of, even 20 years or 15 years before he publishes Origin of Species, is already thinking about how species don't change over time linearly. That is, we have to move away from the idea that change is linear, but that it branches like trees or a bush. And that is where the complexity of ecology meets biology. And we see that, right, in, you know, anyone who wants to discuss the tree of life, right, as I found this on the internet, right? Look at that. I mean, it's so obvious the impact that Darwin has on our understanding of the elemental part of ideas of nature. And this is being written in 1830, 1835, 1837. And of course, I like to do thought maps. So I wrote this one about Darwin being sort of the apical ancestor to all these other people who would later go on and either fight for secular rights, but also fight for the right to understand science as well. And you can go off into the apostles over here, but you have people who really respected Darwin in the 19th century. And you have other people all the way through to today who continue to speak and praise not Darwin the man, but the ideas that have given us our modernity. And then, of course, and finally, if you think of natural selection as the idea that basically launched the ship of all of these other disciplines, you can see that you can see portions of the idea of natural selection and change over time and adaptability in all of these areas, in anthropology, sociology, pharmacology, even in religious studies, right? In genetics and chemistry. And we can think, and that's when we go back to Dabansky's quote, we see that not only would things not make sense if we didn't have natural selection for biology, but if we didn't have natural selection for these areas as well, we would be lost too. In fact, we know with COVID, right, that there are all these strains of the virus, because viruses are biological and viruses adapt to their environment and they change biochemically. We can track a virus. That is natural selection. So two areas I think is really important when we talk about Darwin and science and philosophy. The first is that what Darwin does is liberates us from the poor ideas of our ancestors. That is, we don't need to have inadequacies. Theology might have been the first way to try to understand the universe, but it isn't the best way to understand the universe. And so what Darwin does in 1859 is help liberate us from older ways of thinking about not only where humans come from, but where the cosmos comes from, liberating not only science, but also philosophy. We also, because of natural selection, get to lift off things like patriarchy and imperialism and the idea of some aspects of social stratification. Because if we understand that we all come from the same human family, that the things that we accept as reality, when it deals with race, well, it deals with, social violence, whatever, we realize that if we just take a step back, we would see that so much of what we do is contrived by culture rather than anything else. And so I think these are the two areas that Darwin helps liberate us from. And so as Darwin is coming out and remaking the world through science, we're also finding that in the late 19th century, we're seeing tremendous reform in all areas of Western human life, right? So we're seeing changes in education. We're seeing labor laws that take children out of the factories. We see the women's suffrage movement grow. We see the way we care for prisoners or the mentally ill change as well. We see the idea of unions and workers having power. All of these things are happening. It's a tremendously divergent time of, without trying to use the wrong word, liberalism, of growing outside of being controlled by a patriarchy or a monarchy, you know, and using our humanist values to take care of those who are most endangered, right? And in fact, many of the people who were advocates for all of these human ideals or rights to take care of people who are mentally ill, or how to take care of prisoners, the anti-slavery movement used Darwin's work as a catalyst for their own movement. So you have Marx, and I won't read all of these quotes, but this is when we talk about Darwin being the apical ancestor. Igniting the imaginations because of Origin of Species, igniting the imagination of other thinkers who would go on to change the world in other ways. So here's a quote from Mark: Darwin's work is the most important and suits my purpose, and it improves the basis of natural science for the historical class struggle. So everyone is seeing their area of interest in Darwin's work. By the way, I think when Darwin published Das Kapital, Das Kapital, he inscribes it and sends it to Darwin, and says, "To my dear friend, from your sincerest admirer." So there was a deep respect, Marx of not only Darwin the man, but Darwin's work in terms of liberation. Engels did the same thing. Darwin, by the way, whom I'm reading just now, is absolutely splendid. There is one aspect of teleology and that yet to be demolished. It has now been done. So again, you're seeing these economic philosophers, political philosophers, seeing the value of Darwin's work. This is another Russian philosopher who writes about Darwin's work as well. I won't read all of these. You'll have this to go back to if you ever want to do so. But outside of that, if we really look at the free thought movement, I think the one that Unitarians fall back on, free thinkers fall back on, humanists fall back on, atheists and agnostics fall back on. These are the people who really create in the 19th century and early 20th century, or even mid 20th century, the fodder for people to continue on into the 20th and 21st century. And just to give you some idea here, let me see if I can just lower this, right? So of course, we know the great orator, Robert Ingersoll, the great orator, the great agnostic. He was perhaps the rock star of the American free thought movement of the 19th century. while you wouldn't know it now, if people would follow him from town to town to hear him speak. He would be written about in all the newspapers of the time. And he was, I think, a great thinker for not only atheism and humanism and agnosticism, but for an advocate for the sciences as well, and saw the connection, the deep connection between rational thinking and evolutionary thought. And these are some of the things that he wrote about in Victorian Infidels. This century will be called Darwin's century. He is one of the greatest men who ever touched the globe. He, Darwin, has explained more than the phenomena of life than any religious teacher. So in the 20th century and 21st century, those who depend on the writings of great men like Robert Ingersoll were in turn really depending on Darwin. Darwin is in the background as this apex ancestor. Here's another quote from Ingersoll. And some of these really do excoriate the idea of religious myth and the value of a religious view of the creation of the universe, human place in nature, and so on and so forth. Here's another one. Darwin destroyed the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. There's nothing left but faith in what we know did not happen. Religion and science are enemies. One is superstition and the other is fact. So he's filling up his machine gun of ideas with these bullets. I know it might be not the best metaphor right now, but so he is excoriating religion, and he's doing it because his back is leaning on Darwin's work to inform his ability to convey that we don't need religion to be good, that we don't need religion to be moral, and so on and so forth. This is one of the fun things about writing this book, by the way, is actually reading and finding the adoration of all these social philosophers and humanists and non-believers who really depended on Darwin's work. You can see that they, even if they didn't know each other or come across each other, they were still impacted by Darwin. Here, let me just. So D.M. Bennett, of course, publishes in the late 19th century American Free Thought, the Truth Seeker, which is still in publication today. It is a free thought newspaper. I think there might be two different editions, dueling editions in its current form. But what D.M. Bennett did in America was essentially serialize all of Darwin's work in the newspaper. So if you couldn't afford to buy, or you couldn't find a copy of Origin of Species or The Descent of Man, he would serialize it in the Truth Seeker. And his publication supported, of course, humanist, atheist, agnostics, and really was the lifeblood because newspapers were the social media to create the social capital of the time. Let me see if I can pull up some of these other quotes. Oh, one of Darwin's last interviews is where he comes across and actually says that he considers himself an agnostic rather than an atheist, but he gave up Christianity when he was about 40 years old, which sort of coincides with the death of his daughter, Annie. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we know from the women's suffrage movement, saw Darwin's work as a form of social liberation as well. She, of course, even though Darwin did not support the women's suffrage movement, she saw in Darwin's work the essential importance of scientific understanding of how can I put this, of what it means to be gendered, and how the idea of men having control because they were men was a fallacy created by men. So again, it goes back to not only and this is what Darwin feared, by the way, is that religious people would hate him because it disrupts religious ideology. The patriarchy would be disrupted because women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton would say that women should have equal rights, essentially. Imperialists would have a problem with this because it meant that the idea that white people were superior is not true because we share a common ancestor.
Hey, David,
Yes.
can, I think people might have some questions. Are you soon done or not?
Oh my God. I'll tell you, if you give me another 10 minutes, we can spend the rest of the time talking. How about that?
That's good.
Okay,
Sure.
so I'll go through the rest a little quicker. Again, I'm even happy to send you this PowerPoint if you'd like it.
Love it.
And you can distribute it so you don't have to wait for the video. But here are different quotes. I'll move on to Andrew White, who helped keep the United States, by the way. A very fortunate person to have on your side, who got Europe not to fund the Confederacy during the Civil War. And these are some quotes. Here's just one quote from him. Charles Bradlaugh was the equivalent of D.M. Bennett in the United Kingdom, although he was just as radical when it came to both women's rights as well as evolution. And I won't read you all these quotes, but you can see that you can get the gist of really what I'm talking about here, how Darwin influenced these writers, these intellectuals, and how these intellectuals in turn influenced the rest of society. Annie Besant. George Foote, who's another UK intellectual, and who's living, by the way, until 1915, sort of like Alfred Russel Wallace did. Wallace lived into the 20th century. Darwin did not. He died in 1882. And then people like Chapman Cone, who lived past World War II who was sort of the bridge, one of the bridges into the 20th century for the free thought movement. So, as I like to do with my students, I always say, why does this matter and why should we remember? Does it really mean anything today? Well, I think it does, because I think that the idea of natural selection and science in general is under constant threat from people who, just like in the 19th century, like Wilberforce, would like to see science go away for the sake of faith. Not everybody who's religious, certainly. There are many people who I care about and respect in my own family and as colleagues who are religious, but who are at least secular enough and smart enough to accept science, but not everybody, right? So we know that there's a intellectual gap between the countries that accept science and accept evolution. We know that in the PISA rankings, and this is from 2015, 2018, came out not that long ago, about cognition and understanding, that the United States has fallen further and further behind the rest of the world in terms of math literacy and humanities literacy. We have an art park in Kentucky where basically they teach what I like to call Flintstone science, right? Which was built with taxpayer dollars, by the way. Right? So really, when you're talking about the art park, where dinosaurs and humans are together, you're really talking about the Flintstones. Now, I love the Flintstones, but I would never go visit Ken Ham's insanity. And while this slide is a little old, these people are still out there, right? Mike Pence is going to run for president. You know, this is the guy on the floor of Congress, spoke and said that evolution is not true and that we will find that God is the key to all things. He said this. It's in the congressional record. I'm paraphrasing, but it's the truth. Rick Santorum, who, you're from your state,
Yes.
was very happy when Bush II was doing the No Child Left Behind legislation, wanted to teach, quote unquote, teach the controversy and teach intelligent design alongside evolution in the public science classroom. Fortunately, that got struck from the last part of the bill. Before No Child Left Behind became legislation, they kicked what was known as the Santorum Amendment out. Thank goodness. But he's still around. These people on the side here, Betsy DeVos, she's an evangelical Christian. You think she doesn't accept evolution, and she loves the idea of no oversight with charter schools. So ideas change people, and people change the world. We might be really different in terms of variation, but we are all one single species. And I think that's really important. What Darwin knew which is why he was so afraid to publish, is something that we know today, that we are part of a very big story and one human family. And we have been able to use natural selection to understand not just biology, but all of the material sciences, the hard sciences, and the social and behavioral sciences. And this human knowledge hopefully leads to human goodness. And with that, on to your questions. And I'm sorry, I hope I didn't bore anybody. And I hope I didn't insult anybody. But
No,
I'm here to
I
share.
don't think you did.
Okay,
Thank you, David.
sure.
It's fascinating. And I'm going to read your book again.
Oh,
Does anybody have questions?
I have one.
Slade. Yep.
Oh.
Michael, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much for the presentation, Professor. It was really interesting. I actually have two.
Please, Michael, call me David, please.
Oh, okay. David works. So two things. One is more of a comment. On the list, towards the beginning of the presentation, when you had the list of most influential people, I believe Aristotle was a slave owner. So I think that might push Charles Darwin up a slot potentially.
Oh,
so,
wonderful. I will have to look. Michael, you see, I learn every day. I learn something new. If he was, I'm kicking him off the list. Thank you.
Yeah, he certainly
Thank you,
wrote in
brother.
defense of slavery. So, and I'm pretty sure he was a slave owner. So yeah, sure Charles Darwin's thrilled about that. The second thing, as an anthropologist, I'm curious about your thoughts on Richard Dawkins' idea of memes, which has kind of exploded on the internet for like joke pictures. But original idea was looking at cultural phenomenon in an analogy to like genes, the way genes spread through natural selection, the idea that cultural phenomenon can spread via what he termed memes. I'm curious, what do you think of that idea? Do you think there's merit to that? Do you think there's scientific endeavor to exploring it in that framework?
I think that, I think the jury's still out with stuff like this. I think that images and, we live in a culture where, we've gone from spending a lot of time looking at stuff to just needing the smallest amount. And sometimes it's the fewest words or the image that ignites the imagination that can lead to some aspects of social capital and things like that. But while many things may seem in culture as if they are biological, culture, we are cultural artifacts as well as biological artifacts. But the culture that we create is not biological. It is entirely part of the social fabric, which brings up a lot of variation, right? So you can call it cultural variation, just like you can say biological variation, except there's a difference between natural selection and artificial selection. So I would draw the line in saying that everything that is in nature, right, under the rules of natural selection is Darwin-centered. However, we do know that we have artificial selection because we have a million different types of dogs, right? We have Frankenfish that Monsanto has created, right? So I think memes are more related to artificial selection than it is natural selection.
Thank you, David.
Sure.
Anyone else, Richard?
Do you feel that, or do you think,
I conclude.
do you think that humanity is sufficiently intelligent to govern itself? And what evidence can you cite to base that conclusion upon?
Well, we live in very crazy times, right? where look, this is the difference between conflict theory and other theories in sociology or anthropology that sort of seek, even in moments of crisis, that there are some aspects that are still what's called functional, right? There's functionalism versus conflict theory. And look, I think one thing you can look at that would persuade me to think that we can be better, that relying on our better angels makes us more humane, is just the age in which we are living. There's going to be 9 billion of us soon. Nature, and going back to memes, nature would take 5 of your 7 children. And nature doesn't want to see any human live past 45. But what we have done through the construct of culture and with science and medicine and with policies that allow people to live longer and healthier lives, right? We have been able to extend our human capacity to live longer to, our 90s, our hundreds, more than 100 now. Where if you lived to 100 even 30 years ago, you would get a letter from the president because it was such an oddity, right? 40 years ago, it was like a big thing if you lived to 100. Now, more people are living. Now, that creates issues, right? Is Social Security going to be here in 20 years and all this other stuff? I think that we can, we can obviously be really inhuman to each other. We see what's going on in Ukraine. We see what's going on in parts of the world, we read the news reports, and we see how god awful we can be to each other. We see yesterday that people, or Tuesday, people were shot on the subway by a madman. Except when you look at that, you find that even the people who were shot were helping other victims. That people who were storekeepers were helping the people who were victims of this monster. And so, yes, there are these monsters in the world that would love to flush our common humanity down the toilet. But I think, or I conclude, that we are less hostile to each other than we've ever been before. And then in times of crisis, the better angels of our nature do appear. Now, that's not always, but I think also that humanity, the most dangerous animal to humans are other humans. That is, we've conquered the biological world. We're at the top of the effing food chain, right? But we're destroying the climate, right? We still seem to fight over things as silly as land. We have people who will not wear a mask, even though it's for the public good, right? So you've got all this political instability and all this other fight and flight stuff going on. So we are our own worst enemy. Now, hopefully we grow past these things. I would hope that my generation, which I'm a tail end baby boomer, I have to say, right, would have figured this shit out. But it's clear that we haven't. And so I hope that, as I like to say, the universe has a great sense of humor, because I am the proud father of a 27-year-old, a 25-year-old, and an 8-year-old. So if my 27-year-olds, my kids in the 20s can't figure it out, I'm hoping my 8-year-old can figure it out, and her generation.
I like your optimism, and I noticed that on Facebook because I follow David on Facebook, and a lot of us here are, I wouldn't call us optimists. And I do appreciate your optimism.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and you know what, I sent around the article that you had posted on your Facebook page about the religion thing, and it was like, I don't know how many read it here, but it was pretty scary. And and I think because we're all here in a little, we have our little cocoon, but outside of us is so much. I mean, I worked with people that I don't consider my friends anymore because I can't speak that language. And so it's hard to keep optimistic about all of this. And one of the things I do appreciate is your optimism. And
thank you.
Well, I would still recommend your book. Your book is so entertaining, and you get to know these people as individuals. It's great.
Thank you. Abby and I, because I had written about 80% of the book, and when I sent to the publisher, maybe about 75% of the book, and the publisher wanted a whole bunch of changes to it. And it was brought back to me and said, well, do you have time to change it? And at the time I really didn't. I said, you know what? I had known Abby for quite some time, and I offered her a writing credit if she came in and she did all the fixing of the book and wrote the other 25%. And not only did she do that, but she really helped remake lots of the book. So both of our DNA is in this book, and she, if you ever get a chance to have her, and I would recommend her to your group, you will love her. She's funny, she's entertaining. I think she's equally optimistic as I am, and She's a delightful person. So I'm not doing a commercial for the book, but I'm doing a commercial for my co-author.
Don?
Yeah, thank
Can you hear
thank
me?
you for the presentation.
Sure, John.
One of the practical importance of this is that many religious people use the word secular ethics as an epithet, okay? And the Dalai Lama wrote a book recently that said he wishes all cultures would go to secular ethics, okay? Okay, and the reasoning for that is not obvious to most people, but he believes that the brain, through natural selection, has a part in the frontal lobe that is triggered by injustice, not only in humans, but in animals. He also said something which I don't know. He believes that there's a part of the brain that is triggered for compassion. So
That empathy is hardwired. Absolutely.
Empathy is hardwired, okay? So I think the world would be better off if we could defend the epithets against secular ethics. And
let me say this, and I would put on my reading list for everybody here, Paul Bloom's book, Bringing Up Babies, because he talks basically about this topic. I think it's called Bringing Up Babies, about how ethics and morality is hardwired into us.
Right.
That the golden rule is in our genes. Because they've done studies where babies, right, like 4 months olds and 5 months olds will be in front of 2 puppets, and one puppet is mean to the other puppet, and the first thing that the baby does is go over to the puppet that's been the victim and will not go near the other puppet. Or what they'll do is they'll then change it and have the other puppet be the mean puppet to, take off the idea of, well, maybe the baby likes it because there's a blue bonnet or something like that. And lo and behold, again and again, what you find is that the victim is the one who the baby will go to, and the perpetrator will be ignored or vilified by someone as small as 4 months old.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
that is
And
profound.
you can see it in elephants and dogs and
Absolutely.
animals.
Absolutely.
Okay, now that doesn't mean that we'll all agree on ethics, because
Oh, no.
our ethical beliefs are also a product of culture.
Right.
So there's likely to be disagreements, but it's reason for hope that you can work through differences.
Yes.
Of ethical differences, which I believe is true. I work at ethics at the United Nations.
Oh, wonderful.
And, I just recently was invited to speak to national leaders to UNESCO, and they are really upset that economic reasoning is taken over the world, and they want the Iranian ambassador. I've taught in Japan and China, and there's a lot of people that are upset that the kind of reasoning that the United States used to do through reason is going away. And so this is really an important topic, I think.
I think so. And I'd love to have a conversation, because I actually was the American Humans Association representative to the United Nations for about 5 years. So I'd love offline to please reach out to me if you let me put my, and this is for really anyone here on the call. Let me just quickly put my email in here.
Well, I have your email, David.
Oh, okay. Oh,
I already have it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well,
Yeah,
I put
I
it
will
in case
forward
anyone
it.
wants to reach out and continue any part of this conversation. I always like to say that, we might be doing this now on a Wednesday, on the 13th or whatever day it is. But, we're friends forever. So please feel to reach out to me as a resource, or if you ever need to talk or anything like that.
I will forward your email.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
And we have to close here soon, I think, but I just want to say, you ended your book saying that we apostles are still needed. You wrote about Darwin's apostles, but
Mhm.
now the apostles are us. And I
Mhm.
love that. I love
Thank
that.
you.
So yeah, we could talk forever. I could just sit down and talk to you for hours. I would love it.
Come on, here we go. All right.
So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and go Harrisburg. Come on,
Yeah.
we're all in this together,
Absolutely.
and remain optimistic, because what choice do we have, really?
It's true. That's right.
Yeah,
We have to do it.
yeah,
Okay, everybody else okay here?
great.
All righty.
Yep. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now,
Bye-bye,
be
everybody.
well. Bye
You
bye.
too. Good
Bye-bye.
luck, David.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good
Rachel.
night.